Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It is I, Emily Sophia, aka Mighty Sophia, here to break down for you guys the latest episode of American Gods. We are on Season 1, Episode 2, The Secret of Spoons. So, spoiler alert, before I dive into the mad thick of things, as I shall be endeavoring to bear all in this review, and just in case there are any topics or aspects of the show that I fail to cover and you want to talk about, please by all means bring those things up in the comments below, because this video is just the beginning of the conversation. So I'm going to start things off by discussing briefly some parallels to and departures from the original novel. Again, not getting into any spoilers of stuff that's way further down the line, so you don't have to worry about that. And just so you guys know, in the comments below, I'm going to post some information that I know with regards to the Slavic deities that we are introduced to in the episode. I wanted to talk about those in this video, but there, quite frankly, is not going to be time. And this is the second time I've recorded this review because my camera died in the middle of the previous one and the file got corrupted. So I hope that this goes well and that you guys enjoy. So this episode covers most of the third and fourth chapters of the novel, but starts to swap things around in really interesting ways. For example, lines of dialogue that American Gods readers would immediately recognize are doled out to different characters from the ones who delivered those lines in the book, but nevertheless, it's to strong dramatic and narrative effect, in my opinion. And the Coming to America vignettes are also being reordered, and I imagine many new stories added, so that's very exciting. Also, unlike in the novel, Laura's introduction is, I believe, trimmed down to better suit Shadow's psychological state as it is depicted in the show. Because what we get from Ricky Whittle's Shadow is a man who feels like he's adrift in a dream. An ex-con who's going mad because he can't handle the outside world, much less Mr. Wednesdays. And I sense some parallels to the show Legion in that regard, you know, what with questioning your sanity and the soundness of your mind. Shadow isn't quite ready to understand what's exactly happening with his wife thanks to the gold coin that he dropped in her grave. That revelation is evidently still to come. Generally, though, the show remains very faithful to the source material thus far. The departures are minor and more than welcome, in my opinion. I have no problems with the changes that we've seen thus far. So what follows is my breakdown of an episode that juxtaposes the ravenous hunger of gods old and new with Shadow's hunger for understanding, really. With all these powerful divinities so overtly vying for his attention, he feels like he's just succumbing to madness. For some reason or another, recruiting Shadow is a shared objective for these clashing gods. Their cosmic struggle forces him into a position of finding out what he believes and whether his own mind can be trusted for being sensitive to these otherworldly beings that he's never encountered before. There are other alternate ways of knowing beyond, say, the internet, where you can learn and experience just about anything. And Shadow is just beginning to uncover these, what with his new relationship with Mr. Wednesday and the many gods with whom he's connected. So I gotta say, the performances in this episode are friggin' top-notch, as if I expected anything otherwise, with the likes of Orlando Jones and Ian McShane, Gillian Anderson, Peter Stormare. Pretty much everybody is chewing the scenery with everything they've got, and it is just such an immense pleasure already. It's ridiculously gratifying. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, if you're loving what you're seeing here in the show, I would definitely give Neil Gaiman's novel a try. Anyways, so the episode starts off with Coming to America in 1697. So Anansi, who is also called Mr. Nancy, we first meet him in the form of this neon-dusted arachnid creature listening to a desperate captive on a Dutch slave ship cry out for help. This man cannot make Anansi an offering, but he knows that his voice can be heard, and he promises to sing Anansi's praises all his life, lavished him with the finest gifts, if only Anansi will answer him. And surely enough, he swaggers right on in, donning this friggin' dandy suit that would make the likes of Hannibal Lecter salivate with envy. And yeah, looks fine as hell, and starts raising hell, and brings the fearful captives up to speed on their bleak 300-plus year plight. His monologue begins with, "Once upon a time, a man got fucked." That is the story of Black people in America. So says the charismatic trickster god, striking rage and desperation into the hearts of his congregation. Anansi frees the slaves, commanding them to start an insurrection. Burn this mother to the bottom of the deep blue sea in an act of defiance and worship. Surely the stench of smoke from this vessel going up in flames would be like burning incense to this god. So at dawn, Anansi, in spider form, crawls ashore from a piece of wreckage, clearly living in the aftermath of their sacrifice, and from their sacrifice too. The fact that all of these men believed in his message and decided to take action in that way. So that's ridiculously powerful stuff. And I will say that I mean, Anansi, or Mr. Anansi, is described as being much older in the novel, but I do not think that the casting of Orlando Jones was a misstep in any way, shape, or form. The energy and the charisma that he brings is, it's palpable. It's exciting. I cannot wait to see more from him, and trust me, you're going to. So we go back to a shaken up Shadow who gets stitched up after surviving the wrath of Technical Boy's lynch mob. And he storms over to Mr. Wednesday's motel room, finding him in a white bathrobe and an undressed woman reclining in his bed. Mr. Wednesday futilely attempts to put Shadow at ease, but once he knows that Technical Boy was behind Shadow's brush with death, he's at least marginally more understanding. He says, "What a little asshole," and they don't have a fucking clue. Shouting to the heavens about that. But what about a clue for Shadow? Well, now that wasn't part of the bargain, was it? It's just an occupational hazard, so how about double the salary for his troubles? They decide to amend the compact in that way, and it's really interesting, all the information that Wednesday tries to withhold, and that's kind of part of his personality too, the way that he sees the world, and he wants to kind of keep the wool over Shadow's eyes thus far and ease him into things. So they decide that they'll linger in Eagle Point for maybe another day, and before Shadow can bed down for the night, Mr. Wednesday lets him in on a little something about the, quote, "a little shit in the big limo." And he says, "An assault on you is an insult to me. Don't think because I didn't lose my temper, I'm not angry, or I'm lacking in a plan." I'd say it's a little consolation for the man who was nearly hanged to death just hours before, but hey, it's a start, and Mr. Wednesday is a wily one, so for him to not be a step or 12 ahead would come across as quite the shock. So Shadow takes off his wedding ring as he settles in for a bath, and then later, under cover of darkness, along comes one Laura Moon, looking pretty much like her living animate self. She apologizes for waking him, and he starts saying, you know, they told me that you died, and it's this whole surreal moment, and then she says a line from the book that I so very much love. She says, "Who said I died, puppy?" And the way that Emily Browning? Oh, I forget her name, but the way she delivers that line is just, the sweetness of it is exactly how I imagined that character in my mind. So kudos to her. She tells him it's all a bad dream, only to disappear when Shadow rolls over, and he breaks down in tears, which I think is a very fair reaction to just about everything he's dealt with. So Shadow visits home one last time before committing to the open road with Mr. Wednesday. He sees Laura in the kitchen and then the bedroom, and for now, she's just an apparition that's conjured up by his grieving mind. He starts packing up his things and eyeballs this package for the coroner's office. Not sure what it was doing, being left behind. But he ends up indulging his curiosity and rifles through its contents to find Laura's ring, amid her other personal effects. And then he comes across her phone and looks over her texts with Robbie, which is the grandest of all mistakes, because he scrolls up just far enough to find a lovely dick pic, which his mind superimposes over one of their framed wedding photos. It's such a bizarre moment that it elicited laughter from me, because I'm just like, really? But, you know, again, having to come to grips with her death and the infidelity and all of it at once, his mind is doing some pretty crazy stuff. And it makes sense that he would start to question his sanity not long after this moment. And little does he realize, too, that in using Laura's phone in this way, he has just paid homage to a new god that he has yet to meet and who has yet to offer him a job, but is certainly bent on doing so. So he heads back outside as Mr. Wednesday, quote, helps him process the situation. And Mr. Wednesday plucks a dandelion and tucks it in his pocket as he and Shadow cruise out of Eagle Point, ostensibly for good. Betty is the wind beneath their wings. And then he asks about why it was that Shadow took up coin tricks in the first place. And it turns out Wednesday's pretty good at them too. And then he says, you don't really have the personality to be a magician. You can't weave the stories that are necessary for belief unless you have a little personality. So he says. Kind of makes me think of The Prestige, which is a lovely movie. But Shadow seems to like the craft of it, regardless, just as we later discover how much Chernobog loves the craft of killing. And it's cool, too, because that line was originally something that was just in the third-person narration. Maybe it was a thought on Shadow's part, but it's cool to actually hear Mr. Wednesday and Ian McShane vocalize those words. It's super good. But anyways, so Wednesday tells Shadow to take the side roads to Chicago's, because highways are a dime a dozen. Homogeneous, lifeless. He craves the offbeat and the arcane. So as they take their exit, we see the dandelion seeds from his dandelion drift up into this purple stormy sky. And it's quite a fascinating bit of imagery. And I love that the show isn't shying away from that really bizarre stuff, and that they're using CGI in decent moderation so far. So the ragtag pair make a quick pit stop. Wednesday has a couple of errands for Shadow to run and imparts some slippery instructions beforehand. Because he says, if you aren't going to look out for yourself, then how are you going to look after me? That's what he says when Shadow insists that, oh, we'd never steal from him. He can give him the receipts. He's not going to take that 5%. But yeah, suffice it to say, Shadow's getting some mixed signals from the big boss man. So he starts making his way through the supermarket, ever the man on a mission, until the high-def New World goddess, who is called Media, played by the immaculate Gillian Anderson, who's dolled up as Lucille Ball. She sets her sights on Mr. Wednesday's new muscle and addresses him from her flat-screen TV. He tries to unplug the displays, but the omniscient Lucy Ricardo is not so easily shut down. Even without a power source, she commands the screens with divine ease. From, quote, golden age to golden age, Media's followers have flocked to her electronic altar throughout the decades. And she says, they sit side by side, ignore each other, and give it up to me. Now they hold a smaller screen in their lap or in the palm of their hands. They don't get bored watching the big one. And that's a fun little line, because I think stuff with Media and Technical Boy is aesthetically and thematically changing a lot from the novel, which was written just around the turn of the century. Things have advanced quite a bit since then, but got that fun little commentary on the technological landscape of today. And hey, guess what the irony is? We are using Media to consume this show. So I guess that she wins in pretty much every way, shape, and form. But yeah, at that point, she waves her finger like a magic wand and brings herself into the 21st century in vivid Technicolor. She says, time and attention, better than the lamb's blood, clearly placing herself among the numerous deities that Shadow has already encountered. She's impressed at Shadow's performance against the Technical Boy's thugs and tries to prey on his ego and persuade him to her side, going so far as to offer him a job with her team. And she says, we are now and tomorrow and tomorrow, and undercuts Mr. Wednesday for his inability to adapt and evolve rather, as rapidly as they have. And hey, she can even let Shadow take a glimpse at Lucy's cookies. But, yeah. As tempting as that is, it's a hard pass from the in-over-his-head ex-con who's already questioning everything and reeling from a pretty tragic loss in his life, so I think that's the least of his concerns at the moment. But he meets back up with Mr. Wednesday in Fairfax, declaring that I Love Lucy began to talk to him. And as Mr. Wednesday so astutely points out, Shadow has been singled out for unique abuse, and whoa baby does he have a hand in that. But would he prefer the opposite of being ignored and left alone by these mysterious forces? Because for Wednesday, it's better to be dead than forgotten. So Shadow should be savoring this for sure. But he isn't in the mood to do vocabulary building for Wednesday's language of weirdness, although his employer does again stress the value of letting go and going with the flow. And he says there are bigger sacrifices that one must be asked to make than going a little mad. That is a very, very quotable line there. I have a feeling that is going to be a favorite of mine from this season already. So once they're on the road again, Mr. Wednesday curses the goddamn information age, chucks their phones out the window, and explains his abhorrence for modern communication technologies, preferring instead the drama and intrigue of telegrams and epistolary missives. Once upon a time, each symbol and word cost the sender. Every transmission was purposeful. He and Shadow also discuss his romantic exploits, of course. Nowadays, Mr. Wednesday charms women into keeping him afloat. That is a form of worship that he himself enjoys too. And hey, that's the perfect segue back to Bilquis in the Hollywood area. We're back in her red room where she is devouring lover after lover, lighting candle after candle. We see her lay naked on her bed, fatigued from the repeated satiation of her pleasure, and then she approaches a statue, ostensibly of herself, in a museum. And then she fixes her gaze on these ornate gems in this glass display case, and she sees the contours of her body rise up from under the satin or whatever fabric it is that the jewelry is sitting on. And then she gets to visualize her venerated form adorned in this beauty, and she senses herself the one lifted up in this moment, you know. So I look forward to seeing even more of her outside of the Red Room, and hopefully in her interactions with the other characters too. So finally, we get to meet the Zoria sisters. Now, I am gonna super botch the pronunciation, that's even a word, I don't freaking know. But yeah, these names are a little beyond my common English tongue, so I apologize. I'm probably gonna say I'm weird. But the first sister that we meet is Zoria Vekernyaya. And evidently she says Chernobog will not be happy to see Wednesday. Can you imagine why? And then he immediately goes about flattering her and gracing her with gifts, and she calls in Utranyaya, who nervously accepts the steamy romance novels that Wednesday had Shadow pick up on his behalf. And we discover that these two sisters eke out a small living with fortune-telling, whereas Chernobog, as of yet unmet, works at the slaughterhouse. And then Verkenyaya prepares some black as night, sweet as sin coffee, and speaking of sweet, her fortunes are pretty sweet too, because she's a splendid liar, as Wednesday points out. And she tells Shadow to make himself at home, but not disturb, of course, the third sister, who needs her rest. Very excited to meet her next week. I was so sad we didn't get to that point, but they're pacing themselves. I like it. I'm a little sad, but I can deal. So once Shadow is out of earshot, she starts calling him the worst of Wednesday's men. Apparently, he is the latest in a stream of other fellows who have not worked out. But Wednesday insists that he's getting into things. He's not going to be on the periphery for long. So as these two old acquaintances swap stories, Shadow spies a pair of binoculars on the floor that are quickly swept up by the mysterious third sister, whom we shall not meet until later dates. But yeah, she's a very cool person, and I can't wait to see how she and Shadow interact. So Chernabog comes storming up to the flat and greets a smiling Wednesday by hurtling a lamp at his cheeky dome, and then he begrudgingly accepts his presence and hospitality once Verk and Yaya makes it clear that their house guests are not going to be uninvited, because dinner is already underway. So Shadow keeps the two sisters, the morning and the evening stars, company in the kitchen, and Verk and Yaya explains that they're all relatives, trying to survive together in the Chicago Badlands. They have no servants anymore, unlike the old country. Only themselves, hence her lack of culinary prowess. And then the sisters start looking at tea leaves, and they get to glimpse Shadow's future a bit. Of course, he immediately sees through Verk and Yaya's fortune cookie fate. You know, the whole, you will live a long and prosperous life and all that good jazz. But then she reveals that, hey, at least he's not gonna die of his mother's cancer, so do with that what you shall. Meanwhile, Chernabog rages against Wednesday. Whatever he's selling, he's not buying. And I will say the show hasn't spelled it outright, but there is a war brewing. There pretty much always is. But Chernabog is not easily swayed by Wednesday's charms in this scenario and spits at his promises of future glory. The first sister tells their youngest sister, still unseen, to go back to sleep after the ruckus is raised. And then over dinner, Chernabog shares the tale of his coming to America, the light and dark divide between himself and his brother, whose name is Belobog, and that defined who he became. And then he also talks about his late occupation as a knocker for the cattle industry. He finds this kinship between himself and Shadow, a man whose blackness parallels the forces that shaped his own identity because of the way that his believers perceived him as this black god. Much to the exasperation of his relatives, Chernabog starts to bemoan how the finesse and skill that cattle knocking required has been outmoded by these crude bolt guns that turn every amateur with working thumbs into harbingers of death. So much for killing, he says. He took pride in the way he killed cattle and the craft of slaughter. To him, a good death is art, and apparently leaves behind a good flavor. I wonder what Hannibal would have to say about that. Not exactly changing the subject, Chernabog then challenges Shadow to a game of checkers, which is an honest game compared to the showiness of chess, so he says. He'll play black, of course. Wednesday tells Shadow that he doesn't have to accept the challenge, but really this is his initiation. It's his chance to find himself in this absurd world, and he can't help but take it. And Chernabog is so tickled that he decides to show off his hammer, no longer dripping with sunrise blood, but instead with rust. But 10,000 deaths right there, as he points out on the hammer, and we again see Shadow tapping into this different kind of sight, and he watches as the blood pours over the mallet that Chernabog is cradling in those skull-crushing arms of his. So as the game progresses, Chernabog introduces a wager. If he loses, then he joins Wednesday's nebulous but foolish crusade, and if he wins, he gets to take his hammer to Shadow's skull. Now, Wednesday questions whether Shadow is even up to the task, while Shadow questions how necessary it is for Chernabog to join their ill-defined enterprise. Still, he mulls it over and eventually chuckles in disbelief. It's the nonsensical nature of everything he's experienced since his release from prison that compels him to accept the old god's unsavory bet. Honestly, in a world where anything is possible, where everything is bound to end horribly no matter who you are or what you do, why try to grip onto this moral existence even tighter? There seems to be this whole world under the world that Shadow thought he knew. So if the man he was yesterday viewed death as something to be feared and avoided at all costs, then the man he is today isn't bound by those same anxieties. The bet is most certainly on. And Chernabog sings this melancholic old folk song from the motherland as they play, and we flash to scenes of Chernabog knocking a cow in an open field, which ends up mirroring Shadow's loss to the black god. And so he says, "At sunrise, I get to knock your brains out, and you will go down on your knees willingly. It's good. It's a shame, as you are my only black friend." And I do have to say, too, it's what's really interesting about Shadow's decision to play the checkers game with Chernabog is that in the book it's kind of construed as he has nothing left to live for, you know? And in the show, it's more like, I have nothing left to lose. And I think that that's a really fascinating attitude. And maybe that's something that's more attuned to this modern audience than even the original one that was reading Neil Gaiman's novel. Again, it's these small but big changes that are really reflective of the 2016-2017 landscape in so many ways. So that is my breakdown of this episode. I am really pleased with the direction that things are going in. Continues to be such a stunning and beautiful and intriguing show. There's a lot of subtext to get into that I didn't have time to do in this review, so that's what the comments are for. Y'all take it down there, and I will do my best to meet you there, and I'll be back very soon with my Better Call Saul review. So you guys, please take care of yourselves, okay? And as always, I will be back before you know it.